Good day. Today is Tuesday, 22nd July 2025, and I'm going to return at the start of this program again to a relatively brief discussion of the military situation in Ukraine, which is now developing rapidly. Firstly, we've had some claims from the Russian Defense Ministry as to the nature of the targets in the last big combined missile and drone strike that the Russians carried out 2 nights ago. And the Russian Defense Ministry yesterday made a claim that 3 Patriot missile launchers and an associated radar system had been destroyed over the course of this attack. They also confirmed that Kinjal hypersonic missiles were used in the attack. And in fact, we've been having quite a lot of information about the attack, and it appears that it was indeed devastating and did do significant damage to various industrial and military facilities across Ukraine. Now, I understand that about 2 weeks ago, the Russians claimed that they destroyed 2 other Patriot missile launchers in other places in Ukraine, and they also destroyed, or so they said, one of Ukraine's few remaining S-300 air defense systems, perhaps a legacy system from the original Ukrainian air defense system, which Ukraine inherited from the Soviet Union, or perhaps a system that Ukraine imported or was provided by the East European countries that are members of NATO. I don't know which. Now, it's important to say that none of these claims about the destruction of air defense systems, Patriots or S-300s, can be corroborated independently. The Russian Defense Ministry has produced no pictures or films that I have seen showing the destruction of these systems. But of course, if this was done far back beyond the front lines by missiles and long-range drones, then maybe the only pictures that exist are those that are obtained by satellites. And this is the sort of intelligence that is usually highly classified. So maybe the Russians would not want to produce confirmation of the destruction of these missiles. Having said that, I'm not sure why the Russians would claim that they're destroying Patriot batteries and missiles systems and radars if they were not doing so. Perhaps they've made a mistake, but it seems to me more likely overall that they have indeed destroyed several Patriot missile batteries over the last couple of weeks. Now that, of course, puts a further complexion on the agitated demand from Ukraine for replacement Patriot missile batteries. If the destruction of the earlier 2 Patriot systems took place before Trump's conversation with Zelensky on the 4th of July, the conversations with Zelensky and Merz over the 4th of July, one can perhaps understand the urgency, the degree of panic and urgency behind Zelensky's demand for replacement Patriot missile batteries, because those that he had are in the process of being destroyed. Just saying. But again, I don't know that this is the case. Maybe if these latest Patriot missile batteries that the Russians are saying that they've destroyed, and which, for the record, I believe probably have been destroyed, maybe that this will dampen the fervour of some people in the West to go on sending Patriot missile batteries to Ukraine for destruction there. Who knows? But the point is in that case, the problem that I've discussed in many programs, which Brian Beletic has also discussed over many programs, that the more Patriot missile systems the United States produces, the many more are used up or destroyed in Ukraine. That American production of Patriot missiles and their launchers and associated equipment simply cannot keep up with the rate of expenditure or indeed loss in Ukraine. Well, these latest attacks on Patriot missile batteries in Ukraine and their probable destruction simply underlines the truth of this. And in fact, over the last 24 hours, we've had further statements from the Europeans saying that so far there is still no agreement on how to sell or supply Patriot missile systems to Ukraine. There's no agreement yet about the funding mechanisms. Countries like Germany that are being pressed to supply Patriot missile systems to Ukraine are urgently seeking guarantees from the United States for their early replacement. The United States, which is short of Patriot missile systems itself, and which has multiple competing demands, and which faces a production and supply bottleneck, is slow walking the providing of these guarantees. The whole problem with Patriot missile interceptors, with defense interceptors, is escalating and compounding, and there is no solution in sight. What is going to happen over the next few weeks, I predict, is that there's going to be increasing acrimony and anger in Europe and on the part of Ukraine at the failure to provide Patriot missile systems, or indeed any types of air defense missile systems in quantity to Ukraine. There's going to be bitter complaints about this. There's going to be anger and blame passing. The Europeans will blame the Americans. The Ukrainians will blame both the Americans and the Europeans. The Europeans are going to blame each other. The Americans are going to blame the Europeans. I suspect we're going to be into that blame game in a big scale very soon. But none of this is going to make any difference on the ground because, as I have discussed now, in program after program, you cannot supply what you do not have, and the West simply does not have enough of what Ukraine is asking for or what Ukraine says it needs. Now, the outgoing Ukrainian Prime Minister, Mr. Shmyhal, has apparently said that Ukraine needs 120 billion euros from the West to keep up with the demands on its military, that it needs 120 billion euros. I'm not sure over what time frame or what period. It seems an absolutely incredible amount. I can remember back in the early 2000s when Professor Jeffrey Sachs was trying to get the United States and Europe to provide funding to the Soviet Union as part of the so-called grand bargain to stabilize the Soviet economy and to prevent hyperinflation. As I remember, he was seeking $150 billion to be provided to the Soviet Union over 3 years. Now, that was, of course, well, more than 30 years ago now, 35 years ago. Money was worth more then. I understand that $150 billion in 1991 would be around $350 billion today, a sign, by the way, of how bad inflation over this period has actually been. But just take a step back and think, if the United States and Europe had indeed provided that $150 billion then. Not that much money in the great scheme of things, at a time when, of course, fiscal pressures were much lower than they are today. There was no budgetary crisis in Europe, for example, at that time. Nothing like that. Debt to GDP ratios across the West at that time were far, far lower than today. Well, who knows? Maybe things could have been stabilized with the Soviet economy. Maybe that grand bargain would have been sealed, and the West would not now be spending multiple times more, or so it seems to me, trying to keep Project Ukraine going, even as it is failing. Because, to be clear, I've no doubt that the West has already spent much more on Project Ukraine since 2014, and arguably since 1991, than it did on the Soviet Union back in the 1980s and early 1990s, or was ever asked to do. Anyway, that's another story for another day, but I just make that point because inevitably it's the sort of thing I remember. It stays in the mind, if I could put it like that. Anyway, there is never going to be enough. The West is throwing missiles and money down a black hole. It's going to vanish and disappear. It is not going to change the situation on the battlefronts. Now, a member of the Duran community has contacted me. This person has put together all of the verified figures about production of drones, of tanks, of other things by Russia. This person has then used AI programs to see what that says about the progress of the war, the eventual outcome of the war. And surprise, surprise, these AI programs, which here I think can be trusted. This is the sort of thing where one would assume that they would excel. Anyway, they come up with the inevitable answer that before long, Ukraine is going to collapse, that it will not be able to withstand a drone offensive involving 2,000 drones a night, plus missile strikes that are happening, which the Russians are now conducting with increasing frequency, that it will not be able to hold back a Russian military that is increasingly equipped with tanks, that Ukraine's own forces are weakening, and again, based mostly on, in fact, as far as I can tell, entirely on open source material. These programs agree that Ukraine's forces are declining and declining rapidly. That in fact Ukraine is in a compound trap. That we are looking at an escalating, rapidly developing collapse. And these programs appear to believe that this could happen relatively quickly at some point over the course of the next couple of months. The sheer volume of missiles, drones, armoured vehicles on the battlefronts, shells that the Russians are firing, troops that they're deploying, is simply becoming overwhelming. Brian Beletic on the new Atlas has done a program talking about how the West's production is simply being overwhelmed in Ukraine. Well, that's been my view for some time. AI programs apparently confirm it, and very interestingly, certain articles in the French media now are confirming it as well. Firstly, there was an article in Le Monde looking at the state of Ukrainian military cemeteries in Ukraine. It was saying that these ceremonies are running out of space, that a whole vast new cemetery is being created in order to provide more spaces for the bodies of dead Ukrainian soldiers. And we're told that this new place, this new cemetery, which will be entitled National Military Memorial Cemetery, a first square of 10,000 graves, already partially dotted with wide, light-coloured granite paths lined with benches and lime trees, will welcome the first heroes this summer, 10,000. Eventually, however, 130 or even 160,000 will be laid to rest on this future mortuary site, explains Sergei Derbin, wearing khaki linen pants and a straw Panama in the bright summer sunshine of July. 130, 100 to 60,000 people. Now, maybe the plan, this isn't what the article says, but maybe the plan is to relocate bodies from across Ukraine of fallen Ukrainian soldiers and to bury them in this one cemetery. It's possible, in which case we would be looking at perhaps 160,000 deaths. I don't believe that. I think that more likely this is an overspill cemetery for additional bodies over and above those that have already been buried in multiple cemeteries across Ukraine. Just saying. This person, Mr. Derbin, is talking about 130 to 160,000 dead. And as Le Monde points out, this is already multiples more than the 46,000 that Zelensky himself says are the total number of Ukrainians who have been killed so far in the war. So there it is. Now, that's Le Monde, just talking about cemeteries. Le Figaro has other articles, very interesting articles. Now, I should say, by the way, quickly and in parentheses, that Le Monde and Le Figaro are perhaps the two most storied and internationally best known French newspapers, just to say. But anyway, Le Figaro has articles both by someone based on military sources, and we're told that Moscow's thousand cut strategies intensifying. Offensives are localized in a multitude of small battles fought over a few kilometers. I'm not sure I agree with that, by the way. Some of these attacks, offensives, are actually now on a fairly significant scale. But anyway, the cuts are getting deeper, even though the Ukrainian army is already weakened. It is stretched over a front of more than 1,000 kilometers, lacking sufficiently frequent replacements and human resources. The units are becoming exhausted. And a French military source, says that the Russians are multiplying offensive sectors to disperse enemy reserves. Russia has deployed nearly 700,000 troops in Ukraine, more than the Ukrainian army. Patiently, it continues to nibble away at territory. And then, of course, there's the usual claims about the astronomical casualties that the Russians are suffering. These claims never supported by any independent evidence. But here we have a claim that the Russians are losing 100 men a day and 40,000 casualties a month, dead and wounded. Again, as I said, these figures have no factual corroboration behind them, but I'm not going to dwell on that here. But then the article continues, the Ukrainian army has also lost some of the material it received from the West over the past 3 years. Time plays against it, with the risk of a break in a part of the front. forces, the army of Ukraine is in dire straits. Can they last 6 months, a year? In reality, the war is already lost, continued the military source. In this war of attrition, time changes everything. And then Le Figaro also has an article based on an interview given by French historian Stéphane Audouin-Rousseau. An interesting article. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but basically he says what this channel has been saying for quite a long time now, that this is a war of attrition. He describes it as a siege. He says that this is only the third example of a war that has been fought as a type of siege. He compares it with the First World War and the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988. And he says that this is a siege. This is a country, Ukraine, being placed under siege. He says this is, I think, a rather sophisticated way of saying that Ukraine has been subjected to a war of attrition. He says that the war of attrition is now producing its results, that Ukraine has in effect passed the point of no return, that defeat is now inevitable, that before long Ukraine is going to be faced with a military defeat on the battlefield. This cannot realistically be reversed, and that the only question is how extensive will that defeat be. Though he gives no actual factual or military reasons for thinking that this defeat will not be total if the Russians choose to make it so. In fact, he says things like this. Ukraine, unfortunately, seems to have lost the war, probably as early as the summer of 2023, when it became clear that its long-awaited counteroffensive had failed. I'm going to push back on that again. I've said this many times. Ukraine's counteroffensive in the summer of 2023 did not fail. The Russians defeated it. And unless and until this fact is accepted in the West, no proper discussion of this conflict can take place. But anyway, he then goes on to say one can imagine a spectacular turnaround, but it's not clear how. Of course, when you say this, people are shocked because it's unbearable to think that Ukraine has lost the war. It's unbearable for me too. And he then makes a further point, which is a valid point. There's no point in remaining incantatory. We have to get out of a new denial, that of defeat, after that of the possibility of war itself. I would add another characteristic of wars of position. He really means wars of attrition. Defeat is not immediately discernible when it looms. It takes a long time to appear. Only in the end does it become clear that one side has worn out faster than the other. Now, he's right about all of this, but I would say again that he's being a little bit vague, and I think ahistoric. I don't think wars of attrition are that new. I don't think there's only been 3 of them in the last 100 plus years. I think the American Civil War was mostly a war of attrition, for example, as well as the First World War. I think the Second World War was also a war of attrition, mostly. Most wars of attrition also do involve elements of maneuver. There were elements of maneuver in this war, the war between Russia and Ukraine, mostly in 2022. I suspect that we will see a return to wars of maneuver, a war of maneuver when the collapse in Ukraine comes, unless Ukraine pulls up the white flag before that moment is reached. Ukraine and, of course, the West, which, for the record, I don't expect. Anyway, there we go. That's Le Figaro, that's the French media. It's becoming increasingly difficult, given the realities on the battlefronts, to deny these realities. What is going on the battlefronts? Well, the major battle continues to be around Pokrovsk, though there are many battles taking place in other places. There are further advances in western Donbass. It's clear to me that the Russians are now working towards encircling Novopavlivka in the Dnipropetrovsk region, and they appear to have made very significant and very dangerous for Ukraine advances in the area south of Konstantinovka. But the main fight continues to be around Pokrovsk. And, well, again, there's an awful lot of uncertainty and vague information about what is going on northeast of Pokrovsk, where the Russians achieved a breakthrough around a week ago. Yesterday, Redovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, seemed to believe that the Russians have mostly cleared the Krasnolimansky mine northwest of Novoekonomichny. There were reports yesterday that the Russians have indeed established significant footholds inside Novoekonomichny itself, and that the Russians have completed the capture of certain villages northeast of Pokrovsk, like Fyodorivka, for example. Today, the Russian Defense Ministry said that a village called Novotoretskoye has been captured by the Russian military. Now, I am completely unclear where this place is. There could be more than one. There is such a village that I know about south of another village called Mirolyubova, which is south of the road linking Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka. The trouble is, I believe that the Russians captured this village, Novotoretskoye, some time ago. But it could be that this is the village that the Russian Defense Ministry is talking about. It's sometimes the case that the Russian Defense Ministry, for reasons best known to itself, delays confirmation that a particular village has been captured. However, I seem to remember that there is another village called Novotoretskoye in another area, maybe northeast of Pokrovsk. I might be totally wrong about this, but if there is such a village and it is located there, then that is a further sign of Russian advances in that area. Certainly the Russians do seem to be now closing in on a village in this area called Poltavka, and, well, one way or the other, the situation northeast of Pokrovsk continues to be very, very bad for Ukraine. But yesterday, I spoke of Russian forces having broken into Pokrovsk from the southwest. I speculated that this might be an exaggeration, that it might just be reconnaissance groups operating over a large territory. I suggested that most of this territory might be parkland, the Jubilee Park to be precise. Well, as it happens, late yesterday, confirmation that the Russians have indeed broken into Pokrovsk finally came in the form of a video which originated from a Ukrainian source. And this video showed a car, an ordinary passenger car, as far as I can see, with apparently 3 Ukrainian soldiers driving down the main road of Pokrovsk in central Pokrovsk. And suddenly this car, which by the way was driving down what looked like a deserted road, there was no sign, as far as I could see, of civilians or military people anywhere along the road. The car was driving down this road. Anyway, this car was then ambushed by a Russian force right in the center of Pokrovsk. And apparently the driver survived, though there's some talk that he was wounded, but one of the other passengers in the car was killed. The car continued to move south. It then apparently reached a crossroads and turned left. The men, the survivors inside the car, left and then hid inside some kind of a warehouse building. At least that's the story. Now, I'm not sure exactly what this film means, but it does confirm the presence of Russian soldiers in central Pokrovsk. And these are soldiers that are capable of conducting ambushes against Ukrainian soldiers who are trying to move through central Pokrovsk. Now, there's been information from the Ukrainian side that there's a general shortage of infantry in Pokrovsk. That is indisputably the case. And there is a general shortage of infantry, in fact, at all places, right across the front lines on the part of the Ukrainian army. It is universally acknowledged that it is now desperately short of infantry. Most of the infantry have been killed or wounded. Presumably many of them are going to be buried in those cemeteries that I was talking about at the start of the program. So there is not enough infantry to hold positions. Anyway, the Ukrainians are saying that the combination of a lack of infantry and some poor command decisions by someone has allowed Russian reconnaissance groups to infiltrate Pokrovsk and to reach the center of the city. But the Ukrainians say that the various brigades that are defending Pokrovsk are now being rapidly reorganizing, and that they're moving to try to clear Pokrovsk of these reconnaissance units of the Russian army, and that they will quickly stabilize the situation. Now that certainly seems possible to me. The fact that the car was able to continue to move south along this road does suggest that the Russians are not in full control of southern Pokrovsk. But it looks as if, at least for the moment, the Ukrainians are not in full control of southern Pokrovsk either. Probably they have troops closer to the scene, and probably they will stabilize the situation. But then that brings us back to the reason why this happened at all. The shortage of infantry, bad command decisions. Could it be that whoever is the overall commander in Pokrovsk, facing this relentless pressure from the Russians northeast of Pokrovsk, felt that he had no choice but to redeploy infantry that was previously holding positions in southern Pokrovsk to the northeast of Pokrovsk, creating the gaps which the Russians then exploited. It seems to me as good an explanation as any, in which case the crisis that the Ukrainians are facing in Pokrovsk becomes clear. It becomes clear that there are just not enough Ukrainian soldiers to hold the town. If they reinforce in one position, they have to abandon another. And with the Russian noose around Pokrovsk tightening, this simply cannot go on for very long. Anyway, there it is. Dramatic events taking place in Pokrovsk. There's clearly an intense battle playing out, but I don't think anybody who is following the situation closely has any serious doubt about what the outcome will be. It may take days, it may take weeks, it may take longer still, but one way or the other, the Russians are going to capture Pokrovsk. There is nothing that the Ukrainians can do to prevent it, and the fall of Pokrovsk is going to change to a marked degree the configuration of the front lines. It is going to mean that the Ukrainian defense line, the Pokrovsk, Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk defense line, will have been breached in its most vital and weakest point, and that will open the way for the collapse of the Ukrainian defense system in Donbass. Anyway, that's the situation in Pokrovsk. As I said, there are other battles going on in other places. There's been more battles apparently south of Konstantinovka. The Ukrainian defenses there have been fragmented for some time. There are now sightings which seem to corroborate Russian claims that the village of Yablunovka has fallen completely under their control, in which case, as I said previously, a significant Ukrainian force, a numbering maybe several thousand people, could be trapped south of Konstantinovka. And, well, in the meantime, Ukraine, following Zelensky's imperatives, continues to fritter away resources, involving itself in a slogging match with the Russians over a single village in Sumy region called Kondratyevka. The Ukrainians have been trying to capture it for several weeks now. They've suffered massive losses doing so. 2 days ago, they were saying they'd captured it. Then it turned out that they hadn't. There's an enormous amount of fighting going on around here. The Russians are able not just to bomb, but also to shell Ukrainian positions in this area. By every account, the Ukrainians are suffering very, very heavy losses, all for control of a single village of little significance, but close to the border with Russia, about which Zelensky continues to be obsessed. So anyway, an attrition war, all the indications are that we are moving towards its crisis. And, well, I discussed in my program yesterday reports about long-range strikes by the Ukrainians against Russia itself with missiles, which could be identical to the Taurus missiles. But there are reports now that the Russians have a very good understanding of the Ukrainian logistics and warehouse system. And since they're now able to conduct strikes all over Ukraine, targeting individual facilities where they know that equipment from the West is being stored, it could be that they're already acting to destroy this threat from these missiles. Maybe those Patriots and that radar system that the Russians say they destroyed were not even positioned on the battlefield. Maybe they were an earlier delivery from the West, which was still in a storehouse, and the Russians found out where it was and destroyed them there. Who knows? Anyway, All of this may explain Zelensky's decision, one of the reasons that explains Zelensky's sudden decision to resume the negotiations in Istanbul. As I discussed in recent programs, Zelensky had made a whole series of public comments over the last couple of weeks, saying that as far as he was concerned, the Istanbul process was exhausted, that it wasn't leading anywhere, that there was no point in pursuing it. He then tried to sack his chief negotiator, the former Ukrainian defense minister Rustem Umerov. He sought to pack him off to the United States by appointing him ambassador to the United States. The Americans put their foot down and said that Umerov was going nowhere. They weren't going to prevent Zelensky from sacking Umerov as defense minister, but he needed to remain in Kiev, and he was needed also to continue to lead the negotiations with the Russians. And Zelensky duly appointed him Secretary of Ukraine's National Defense and Security Council, and announced a few days ago that the negotiations in Istanbul between Ukraine and Russia would resume. And he's just announced the makeup of the Ukrainian delegation. And from what I can see, there are no changes, and Umerov remains chief negotiator. By the way, there are some claims, some people who are claiming, based on recent film of Zelensky, that he's looking increasingly stressed and tired, presumably because of the situation on the battlefronts and because of the missile strikes, the missile and drone strikes. They're saying that he's increasingly looking like someone who is basically on the edge, on the physical edge. Now, that may very well be true, but unfortunately, I'm not able to say. As many of you know, I have vision problems, and looking at films and pictures of Zelensky, such as one sees on laptops and computers, I'm not able myself to see much difference. But I'm not, insisting on that. Maybe he is as tired and as stressed as people are saying. Anyway, he's now set out what he wants the negotiators to do when they go to Istanbul. And he says that they're going to meet with the Russians tomorrow. And he says that he wants the negotiators to go to Istanbul to negotiate another prisoner exchange. That should not be particularly difficult. To try to pressure the Russians to allow more children who from Ukraine, from Donbass, who are in Russia, to have those children returned. As far as I'm aware, the Russians have never refused any request from any family, any Ukrainian family, for their children to be returned to them. And I know that they've done that in many cases, but I'm not going to discuss this issue in this program. My impression is that the main part of Zelensky's instructions to Umerov and to the Ukrainians was to try to get the Russians to agree to a summit meeting between himself, that's to say Zelensky, and Putin. Zelensky, for weeks now, ever since the negotiations in Istanbul were first mooted by Putin back in May, Zelensky has been relentlessly pushing this idea of a summit meeting between Putin and himself. What exactly he thinks such a summit meeting would achieve, he's never satisfactorily explained. Why he imagines that if he were to meet with Putin, Putin would somehow agree to a ceasefire or to a freezing of the conflict in the way that Zelensky wants. I just don't understand. Back in May, it made a certain kind of sense for Zelensky to insist on it. He didn't want to continue with the negotiations in Istanbul. In fact, he didn't want the negotiations in Istanbul to take place at all. And bringing up the proposal of direct negotiations between Putin and himself did make a kind of propagandistic sense as a means of blocking those kind of negotiations between negotiating teams. In fact, I remember that before the first meeting in Istanbul in May, Zelensky flew to Turkey, not to Istanbul, but to Ankara, said that he'd come to meet with Putin. Putin, of course, didn't come. He seemed unwilling to send negotiators to meet the Russians in Istanbul. He kept the negotiators in Istanbul waiting a whole day. And eventually it was Erdogan who had to talk him out of it and get him to understand that Putin would not come and that the Americans were expecting him to send negotiators to Istanbul and that he needed to send them. And then, as I remember, Zelensky left and visited various European countries and made his sense of grievance about the whole thing fairly clear. But as I said, the idea of trying to block serious negotiations with the Russians by coming up with this proposal for a summit meeting between Putin and himself looks to me as if it's exhausted its propaganda value. But Zelensky simply won't give it up. He still talks in that way about a summit meeting between himself and Putin. The Russians are not interested. And we've had a number of statements over the course of the last day or so from Peskov, Putin's spokesman. Now, I should say that the Russians have confirmed that the makeup of their delegation, the one that's going to Istanbul, is unchanged, despite attempts by Ukraine and indeed by the United States, and despite constant ridicule of him by Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, Medinsky remains chief negotiator and head of the Russian delegation. The Russians obviously are not going to let the Ukrainians, the Americans, or NATO pick their negotiating team for them. And anyway, it's going to be the same delegation. It's going to be headed by Medinsky. Medinsky will once again face off against Umerov, presumably at the same meeting place in Istanbul. And Peskov went on to say this, and I'm taking this now from Interfax. Moscow confirmed its interest in holding the third round of negotiations on Ukraine, which should include an exchange of opinions on Moscow's and Kiev's memorandums, which are diametrically opposed thus far, Russian Presidential Press Secretary Dmitry Peskov told journalists on Monday. There's our draft memorandum and there's a draft memorandum presented by the Ukrainian side. There's going to be an exchange of opinions and negotiations on these two drafts, which, so to speak, are absolutely diametrically opposed thus far. A lot of diplomatic work is ahead. There are no changes in Russia's negotiating team. You know that we're in favour of a third round of negotiations. As soon as there's an understanding on the dates, we'll immediately inform you. And the word is, by the way, that the next meeting will take place tomorrow, which is to say on Wednesday. And then there's the key part. The Kremlin does not expect any breakthroughs from another round of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul, whilst Russia is determined to attain its goals in the Ukrainian settlement process. Certainly, there's no reason to expect some miraculous breakthroughs, and this is hardly possible in the current situation. We are determined to achieve our objectives. We are determined to secure our interests and perform the tasks that we've set ourselves all along. And that is what Peskov said. So the Russians are not giving an inch. They will meet the Ukrainians. They will refuse the summit meeting with Putin. They will not agree to a freeze of the conflict or a ceasefire. They will tell the Ukrainians that we want to discuss your memorandum, which we're going to reject, and we're going to discuss our memorandum, which we insist that you accept. We want your opinions about our memorandum, but our objectives, the objectives that we set ourselves, that Putin laid out when the special military operation began, and which he more forcefully reiterated in his speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024, and which perhaps have been hardened since, as I have discussed in recent programs. Those objectives, which are in effect also demands, remain unchanged. We expect you, Ukraine, eventually to accept them. And of course, if you don't, we have the ascendancy on the battlefields. We will win the war. And at that point, we will impose them. Or if we choose not to impose them, we will act in a way that will mean that Ukraine, as we know it, will no longer exist. So an uncompromising position from the Russians. Now, I took all of that from Interfax. TASS has its own account of Peskov's words, but it is very similar. And it quotes Peskov as saying, "Let's be honest, the issue of a Ukrainian settlement is so complicated that even reaching agreement on prisoner exchanges or the return of bodies is already a success." So I don't share your skepticism. I'm not sure what the skepticism was all about. There will be no magical breakthroughs. Apparently, Peskov used the word magical breakthroughs. Such outcomes are hardly likely in the current situation. No breakthroughs, no magical breakthroughs, no compromise on the Russian side. They've got the Ukrainians, they forced the Ukrainians back to Istanbul. Zelensky has tried to walk away from Istanbul. The Americans are not letting him. The military situation in Ukraine continues to get worse, and the Russians remain as implacable as ever. Meanwhile, we still have the threats of sanctions and tariffs from the United States. One of the most extraordinary and interesting facts over the last few days, weeks, is how little Donald Trump's words about the tariffs and the sanctions are being heeded by anyone. The Russians continue to go about their business, waging war in Ukraine. Putin has been taking an interest in economic matters recently. He visited a gigantic factory steel factory and machine building factory in the Urals at a place called Magnitogorsk, very famous factory built by the Soviet Union in the 1930s with American help, by the way. Just saying. Anyway, he visited Magnitogorsk. He spoke about industrialization there. He's had further meetings with other officials talking about the import substitution program. He's just passed regulations to protect the Russian car industry. He definitely intends to go to China in September. The Russian media, by the way, is now full of speculations about a three-party meeting between Xi Jinping, Putin and Trump in Beijing. To repeat again, I don't expect Trump to go. I got a very interesting email from Eve Smith of Naked Capitalism, who made the entirely valid point that not only would the Europeans and the hardliners in Washington be utterly horrified if Trump did go to Beijing and attend the Victory Day celebrations in China, currently a US adversary, over Japan, supposedly a US ally. But Japan would be even more horrified also. And she is right. I simply don't believe it's going to happen. But the extraordinary thing is the Russian media are talking this up now. The Chinese media are talking this up now. One wonders whether an invitation is going to be sent and whether the real purpose of all of this is to pay Trump back in his own coin in some way, to embarrass him by making an invitation to him which he's bound to refuse, but which will make it appear as if it is he who is refusing to meet with Xi Jinping and Putin, even as he constantly says that he wants to. I don't understand the point of these games myself, but I do understand that they're part of politics at the moment. Anyway, everyone else, India, China, the ASEAN states, they continue to do their business with Russia as they always have. As I said in a recent program, the Russian energy minister has recently been to China and done deals there. India is apparently buying more fertilizer from Russia. There are other deals apparently in the pipeline. There is really no sign that the world is paying any attention at all to Trump's threats of more tariffs and sanctions against Russia or against Russia's trading allies. Nobody seems to take this threat seriously, apart perhaps from Lindsey Graham, who continues to wander around the television studios and insist on it. Maybe the world is complacent about this. I don't know. But I mentioned Professor Sachs, Jeffrey Sachs, earlier in the program, and the grand bargain plan that he was trying to sort out in the late 1980s and early 1990s between Russia and the United States, and be it the Soviet Union and the United States, where he's back, and he's been pointing out that if there was a return to the economic war between China and the United States that we saw earlier this year, and if the Chinese retaliated in the way that they did on the previous occasion, it would not take very long before the whole US economy came to a grinding stop. And I'm sure he's right. I have no doubt at all that he is right. And I think many people around the world assume that this is the case. And for that reason, perhaps complacently and unwisely, they assume that none of this is going to happen. Anyway, there it is. The war goes on. The Russians continue to advance. There are going to be, no doubt, negotiations in Istanbul tomorrow. Peskov tells us there's not going to be any magical breakthroughs. Probably we will get a prisoner exchange. probably the Ukrainians will float the idea of a summit meeting between Putin and Zelensky. The Russians will shoot that down, and the negotiating process will grind on. The Russians will reject ideas of a ceasefire or of a freeze. They sense that things on the battlefronts are moving their way, and they will use the meeting in Istanbul to point that out to the Ukrainians and to increase the diplomatic pressure. Perhaps at some point the Ukrainians will crack, maybe at a future meeting, even as the military situation deteriorates. The Ukrainians will start to discuss the Russian memorandum seriously and make counter proposals based on that memorandum that the Russians will feel able to work with. But I don't think we are at that point yet. Meanwhile, the military situation continues to dictate events. As I said, before long, Pokrovsk will fall. That will spark undoubtedly more panic and a deepening sense of crisis, not just in Ukraine and in the West, but to repeat again, the longer this goes on for, the shorter the time becomes. It's an illusion to think that this war can go on indefinitely, or that it will take the Russians years to occupy the whole of Ukraine if the war continues along its current path. Just saying. The longer this war continues, not only will the shorter the time for a diplomatic settlement become, but that time space for a diplomatic settlement is going to start shrinking dramatically. And inevitably, there will come a moment when not only will it shrink dramatically, but when the Russians could decide suddenly to escalate their demands and escalate them dramatically, to insist, for example, on the transfer of Odessa to Russian control or joint control between Russia and Ukraine or something like that, or maybe the whole of Ukraine's Black Sea coast, who's to say, or where the Russians could start demanding total demilitarization by Ukraine and Ukraine granting Russia the right to station troops in Ukraine itself. We're not quite at that point yet, but I think that those people in the West who still believe that there's time and space before such demands could be made are deluding themselves if they think that that time is long. It could be that we might be looking at a collapse in just a few weeks' time, in which case, of course, the Russians might make much more fierce demands, and it will be very difficult then for the Ukrainians to resist them. Now, here I'm going to go back to that article in Le Figaro, the one which was given by the French historians, the interview by the French historian Stéphane Audouin-Rousseau. And he points out that in attrition wars, the situation can change. The collapse, when it comes, will come suddenly. I've been making this point, this very same point, by the way, since 2022. That is the nature of attrition wars. One's seen this in many wars. The American Civil War also ended very suddenly. It was expected by most people to continue for much longer than in fact it did. And Mr. Uzo gives an example, which is the First World War. Let's do a little thought experiment. Let's imagine that in early October 1918, a group of military experts, journalists and historians were gathered in a neutral country to ask their opinion on the situation. And now suppose someone had then suggested that Germany had already lost the war. Well, everyone would have cried out. At that time, Germany was still occupying immense territories in the east at the expense of Russia since the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. It occupied the whole of Belgium and large parts of France. It's true that the German army had been retreating since the summer, but nowhere had the front line given way. The Germans were inflicting heavy losses on the Allies, since it was the Allies who were on the offensive and who were therefore taking the greater risks. So where was the German defeat? That's in October 1918. In fact, 4 weeks later, on the 11th of November 1918, Germany in effect capitulated. It signed the armistice, which set the scene for German capitulation in the First World War. And Mr. Rousseau goes on to say, in reality, Germany's defeat had been certain since July-August 1918. It had happened, but it was not yet appreciated. Since the summer, the German General Staff had been well aware of it and was calling for negotiations to be launched. It was the politicians in Germany who didn't understand it, and of course neither did German public opinion. The failure to understand the fact of defeat in 1918 was one of the causes of the political events in Germany after the First World War. Well, he is absolutely correct. When wars of attrition end, they can end suddenly and very dramatically and very fast. We might be in a situation today when the Russians are slogging it out with the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka, but if in, say, 3 months' time the Russians are outside Kiev, I won't say that I won't be surprised, but I won't be completely shocked or astonished. Just saying. Anyway, that's where I'm going to finish today's Ukraine coverage. There has been some information on the situation with respect to Iran and the arguments about Iran's nuclear enrichment program. Now, Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, has given an interview to Fox, and President Trump appeared to see Araghchi's comments, to hear Araghchi's comments, as admitting the destruction of Iran's nuclear facilities. I've watched that interview, and that was not my sense of what Araghchi actually meant. But anyway, and for the record, this is how the Tasnim news agency, an Iranian news agency, reports his comments. Iran will not give up nuclear enrichment, Araghchi confirmed in an exclusive interview with Fox News. When asked why, Araghchi said, well, because this is our achievement, a scientific achievement that we have achieved by ourselves. Why would we want to import enriched uranium when we can produce it ourselves? Responding to comments from Fox News that Iran has taken uranium enrichment levels to 90% or 60% instead of 35%, the foreign minister has said, no, we have never gone to 90%. We remain committed to below 5% to produce fuel for nuclear power plants. We also have enriched uranium up to 20%, because we have a research reactor in Tehran, which is called the Tehran Research Reactor. It's absolutely true. And by the way, that reactor was donated to Iran by the United States as far back as 1967. Just saying. Anyway, then Arakci went on to say, we are enriching uranium for our own needs. And we once went up to 60%, and that was after the sabotage in our nuclear facilities. He's not talking about the attacks on the nuclear facilities. He was talking about earlier sabotage attacks using, I believe, computer viruses and that kind of thing. And then we did go up to 60%, and that was after the sabotage of those facilities. But I was a negotiator at that time. I told our American interlocutors that we would go down immediately if a nuclear deal was achieved. And then Fox asked him about the damage to the Iranian nuclear facilities, and if that meant that the nuclear enrichment activities had been stopped. And Arakci said, it is stopped now, yes, because the damage was serious and severe, but obviously we cannot give up our enrichment because it is an achievement of our scientists. And now more than that, it is a question of our national pride. So, he was then asked, do you have nuclear facilities in other underground sites? And he said, because of the constant threats by the Israelis, by the United States in the past, we had no way but to protect our facilities and to protect our material and protect our scientists. So my message to the United States is that let's go for a negotiated solution for Iran's nuclear program. So as far as I can see, what Arakci is basically saying is, yes, we have suffered some damage. Our nuclear sites were indeed badly damaged as a result of the American attack. We are still assessing how extensive that damage is. No, we are not enriching uranium further at the moment, but we remain fully committed to doing so. You cannot prevent us, you cannot stop us from enriching uranium because that is our choice. The only thing you can do is negotiate with us about the limits of enrichment. And elsewhere, he also said that Iran is in no hurry to meet with the United States and is still looking for guarantees. So, all of this is fully consistent with the Iranians making preparations to resume nuclear enrichment. Now, here we come to perhaps the more interesting things. The Iranians have recently had certain very intense interactions with the Russians. Ali Larijani, who is Ali Larijani, who is an advisor to Ayatollah Khamenei, the Iranian leader, the supreme leader, has just had a meeting in the Kremlin in Moscow with Putin. And the Russians have provided a readout and a picture of the meeting. They say that Vladimir Putin held a meeting in the Kremlin with senior advisor to the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Ali Larijani. At the instruction of the supreme leader, Ali Larijani presented the views of the Islamic Republic on the current escalation in the Middle East and notably surrounding Iran's nuclear program. The Russian side expressed support for stabilizing the situation in the region and resolving any issues pertaining to Iran's nuclear program via political means. Now that doesn't tell us a great deal, but the expression the Russian side might mean that we're talking about a meeting between delegations rather than just individuals, and that might suggest that some kind of plan was being discussed at this meeting. Now, the Iranians have provided their own account of this meeting. They say that in the meeting, Larijani conveyed Tehran's assessment of the situation in the Middle East and around the Iranian nuclear program. And then the Iranian account simply reproduces the Russian version, the Russian readout. So this looks like a very confidential meeting. The Russians and the Iranians want everybody to know that it took place, but they're not telling us what exactly was discussed. Now, this isn't the only meeting that the Russians and the Iranians have had with each other, because as Putin was meeting Larijani, and this meeting took place on the 20th of July, the Russian and Iranian defense ministers were also meeting, and this meeting also took place in Moscow. Now, we only have an Iranian account of this meeting. At least I've only seen a full Iranian account of this meeting, and it reads as follows. The Iranian and Russian defense chiefs have discussed strengthening bilateral cooperation in defense and military affairs. Iran's ambassador to Moscow, Qasem Jalali, says. He said Iranian Defense Minister Brigadier General Aziz Nazirzadeh and his Russian counterpart Andrei Belousov met in Moscow on Monday. Jalali said the meeting focused on reinforcing bilateral cooperation in the defense and military fields. The diplomat noted that the Iranian minister, that's Nazirzadeh, the defense minister, also attended the July 20th meeting in Moscow between President Putin and Ali Larijani, a senior advisor to leader of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei. So, the Iranian defense minister and Khamenei's senior foreign policy advisor, Ali Larijani, a very well-known personality in Iran, and a negotiator, also an Iranian negotiator with the Americans in the past, have had meetings with Putin and with the Russian defense minister in Moscow. Now, there's been a lot of speculation in the last couple of weeks about Iran tilting away from Russia and tilting towards China and perhaps buying weapons from China. And there's been a lot of discussions about the Iranians maybe buying JC-10 fighter jets from China. But as far as I am aware, there has never been a meeting of this kind between Iranian officials and Chinese officials at this very high level, as the one that has taken place in Moscow. I want to stress again that meetings between China and Iran will not cause any alarm in Moscow. I'm simply stating that for the moment, it looks to be more likely that it is Moscow to which Iran is currently turning towards for help in beefing up its defences. Because this is what this meeting looks like to me. It looks to me as if the Iranians and the Russians are now engaged for the first time in serious discussions about Iran obtaining Russian help to upgrade Iran's air defense system. Putin has said that the Russians offered the Iranians help with establishing an integrated air defense system, which the Iranians previously rejected. I suspect that the Iranians have reconsidered that and have now come to Moscow and are now discussing with the Russians directly what the Russians might be able to do. To repeat again, this does not exclude the possibility of Iran also sourcing military material from China. It's just that I think that the source is more likely to come from Russia at this time than from China, because the relationship, the military relationship with Russia is more long-standing. And of course, all of these meetings have just taken place shortly after the announcement by Tehran and Moscow that the Strategic Partnership Treaty signed by Putin and Pezeshkian in January is now in force. It's been ratified by both the parliaments and ratified also in Iran by the Guardianship Council. So this Strategic Partnership Treaty is in force, and probably it is not a coincidence that the Russian and Iranian navies are conducting a joint naval exercise in the Caspian Sea with a large tug, powerful tug, that serves with the Russian Navy, visiting and anchoring in an Iranian port, also on the Caspian Sea. Making it clear, by the way, to all the littoral countries on the Caspian Sea, which include, of course, Azerbaijan, with which Russia is currently involved in a spat, who the real powers in the Caspian actually are. Now, also, and I mentioned this in another program a short while ago, there have been this film showing Russian Ilyushin-76 transport aircraft of the Russian Air Force arriving in Iran, and nobody, of course, knows what exactly those aircraft were carrying, what they were bringing with them. Anyway, I'm going to make a prediction. I think that now talk about the Russians providing Iran with an air defense system, or at least help to setting up an air defense system, is for real. And for the record, I think that the Iranians are probably stringing the Americans along. They're saying, well, we don't want to talk, we want these guarantees from you, but we're not saying we're not going to talk. We're going to insist on our right to enrich uranium, but for the moment we're not enriching uranium. We have had damage to our facilities. We're not saying how bad that damage was, but bad it was. It was really, really oh so bad. I think the Iranians are stringing the Americans and perhaps the Israelis on, because they're now at work with the Russians and perhaps the Chinese as well to build up their defenses. So that's where I think we are with the situation between Russia and Iran. And of course, just to say, if we have a military collapse by Ukraine over the next couple of weeks, then the Russian military position in the Caspian will become much, much stronger. Anyway, this is where I finish today's program. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs over on our various channels, platforms rather, Locals, Rumble and X. You could support our work via Patriot and Subscribestar by going to our shop. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.